The crisp snap of the wedding folder echoed as my own son handed it back, saying, "Mom, your name's not here." Still, I adjusted the necklace I gave his bride last year, one she now wore while pretending I was a stranger. As the invitation brushed the floor, I caught the scent of her designer perfume paid for with my dead husband's savings. While I stood in silence, I remembered teaching her how to eat with a fork when her own mother left. The same girl I raised had erased me and trained my son to do it with a smile. That's when I turned, walked out, and returned with the one woman she feared more than me, her real mother. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Maggie had always loved the hustle and bustle of wedding preparations. She'd spent years running a restaurant, managing chaos with a smile, so there was something comforting in the familiar whirlwind of people moving about, adjusting decorations and checking lists. As she stepped into the bright, sunlit ballroom overlooking the Charleston waterfront, a part of her heart swelled with anticipation. It was her son's big day. She was going to help, just like always. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing softly as she approached the tables stacked with florals and ribbons. She was early, of course. Maggie always arrived early. It gave her a chance to take in everything, to contribute without anyone noticing. She saw the caterers, the florist, the event coordinator, all busy in their worlds. But then, like an unwanted shadow, Tessa appeared. Tessa's presence was always a little too poised, a little too perfect, and today she had a look on her face that made Maggie pause. It was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, the one Maggie had seen before when Tessa was hiding something. "Maggie," Tessa said, her tone almost too sweet. "You're here early, I guess you're excited." Maggie nodded, the warmth in her voice covering the coldness she felt in her chest. "Just wanted to help, you've got a lot to manage." But before Maggie could step forward, Tessa placed something in her hands. It was a printed guest list, crisp and new. Tessa tapped it with a perfectly manicured finger as though presenting a document of great importance. "You're not on it," she said flatly, her voice devoid of the warmth it had once carried when she was first part of the family. She didn't look Maggie in the eye, instead she stared down at the paper, almost as if it were an object to be feared. Maggie's eyes flicked over the list, the names of familiar faces swimming before her. Her name wasn't there, the letters blurred as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Andrew stood beside Tessa, a ghost of a man in this conversation. His eyes avoided hers completely. He mumbled something, a half apology or maybe just an excuse. "Limited capacity, Mom, you know how it is. We just couldn't fit everyone." Tessa nodded, as if to affirm Andrew's words. The vendors, busy in their tasks, suddenly became aware of the uncomfortable scene unfolding before them. The air felt too thin, too tight. Maggie stood perfectly still, absorbing the cold sting of rejection. Her hands, which had once served plates and poured wine for countless customers, now clutched the guest list with a trembling she refused to show. She could feel every breath in her chest, each one a reminder that this moment would mark a point of no return. Tessa's eyes flickered over her, then darted away, already shifting her focus to the next thing. Maggie could feel the finality of it. This was it. There would be no grand gesture, no explanation. Maggie didn't belong here anymore. She wasn't even worth a seat at her own son's wedding. Without a word, Maggie stepped back. She turned slowly, the sound of her shoes against the floor a quiet thrum in the cavernous room. Vendors exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. Maggie didn't need to hear their whispered pity. She had her own thoughts to navigate, her own hurt to bury. As she stepped outside, the warmth of the sun did little to ease the chill inside her. The drive back to her house was a blur. She'd always thought she'd walk into this house filled with memories of Andrew's childhood, of laughter and shared moments. But now it felt empty, as hollow as the gesture that had just been delivered to her. She opened the door and it hit her. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with the ghosts of what once was. The photos of Andrew's first steps, the family vacations, the birthday parties. Everything now seemed distant, like a story someone else had told. She hadn't even realized she'd been holding her breath until it rushed out, sharp and quick, when the door clicked shut behind her. The house was still, too still. And Maggie, standing alone in the hallway, was left. Nothing more than the silence and the remnants of her own quiet dignity. The house felt like a hollow shell, each room echoing with memories that seemed too far away now. Maggie sat in the living room, staring at the photograph on the mantel, Andrew's graduation picture. It was framed, but the glass felt like it was cracking under the weight of everything she hadn't said. She hadn't even bothered to change out of the dress she wore to the wedding venue. The fabric felt stiff, as if it too could remember how this day had gone wrong. Her gaze shifted to the old kitchen table where she used to sit with Andrew as a boy, helping him with his homework, making plans for the future. She was supposed to be a part of his future today, too, his wedding, the day he'd promised would be the happiest of his life. Instead, she'd been left out. Her mind drifted back to the early days when Tessa had first come into their lives. Tessa had been nothing like she was now. Back then she had been young and desperate, scraping by with no job and no real support. Maggie had seen the tears in her eyes when she came to the restaurant, a girl with nothing but a fierce pride and an empty stomach. Maggie never asked for details, just fed her extra portions, a meal to take home. Small kindnesses, as simple as they seemed. Maggie had never thought Tessa would forget that. Her thoughts shifted and she remembered the sacrifices she had made for Andrew. When college tuition bills piled up, when there seemed to be no way forward, Maggie had sold family heirlooms, rings that had belonged to her mother, a silver tea set passed down for generations. She never hesitated. Andrew was worth it. Now the weight of those choices felt like an echo in her chest. The sound of the doorbell pulled her from her reverie. She wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitantly, Maggie walked to the door and opened it to find Pastor Joel standing there, his expression a mixture of concern and understanding. "Pastor," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, "what brings you here?" He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, noting the stillness. "I heard what happened," he said gently, his voice soft but firm. "Maggie, tradition gives you the right to be there. You don't need an invitation from them. You've earned it." Her chest tightened at the thought. Shouldn't she be the one to decide her place in this family? "I'm not crashing their wedding, Joel," she replied, her voice steady though the hurt was still sharp. "I have my dignity." Joel didn't argue, but he placed a hand on her shoulder, offering comfort without words. She appreciated the gesture but felt something stir inside her. Why should she have to fight for respect? He left quietly and Maggie stood in the doorframe, watching him walk away. The silence returned like a heavy fog. She wandered back to the small desk her late husband had used, rummaging through old papers. There she found a letter from him, one she hadn't opened in years. The familiar handwriting filled her with a quiet grief as she read it. "If he forgets who raised him, remind him gently." Her throat tightened at the words. Those simple lines had always carried the weight of years of sacrifice, of unspoken love. Her husband had never doubted Andrew's potential, even when things had been tough. He had believed that a mother's love could never be replaced, no matter how far away her son might drift. Maggie put the letter down, letting its weight settle on her heart. Maybe it was time to remind him. But just as quickly, a wave of uncertainty washed over her. Was it too late? Could she still reach him? The sound of the ticking clock on the wall filled the room as she stood there, torn between the man she had raised and the son who had turned away from her. The answer felt out of reach, but one thing was clear: Maggie wouldn't give up. Not yet. The knock on the door was sharp, urgent, so out of place in the quiet, still house. Maggie paused, her fingers still pressed to the letter from her late husband. It had been hours since Pastor Joel left, and the silence felt as heavy as the weight in her chest. She stood up slowly, her mind still swirling with thoughts of Andrew and Tessa. Opening the door, Maggie was met by a stranger, tall, sharp-featured, with a professional air that immediately marked her as someone used to being taken seriously. She wore a tailored blazer, her hair styled neatly, and her eyes were calm, calculating. The woman held out her hand. "Good afternoon, I'm Fiona Grant," she said. "I'm an attorney. I believe we've met before, though it's been a while." Maggie blinked, trying to place her face. Her mind clicked through old memories, but nothing surfaced. She was about to say something when Fiona continued, her voice steady but laced with something Maggie couldn't quite identify. "You helped me years ago," Fiona said, "when I was in a bad place, and I never forgot it." Maggie's heart skipped. She still didn't recognize the woman's face, but the words brought a flash of understanding. There had been so many people through the doors of her restaurant, many who had come in with nothing. Maggie had never expected to be remembered by any of them, but she remembered helping them. How could she not? Do you need something?" Maggie asked, her voice cautious. Fiona smiled softly. Actually, I think you might need something from me. Maggie frowned slightly. I don't understand. I've heard about your son's wedding, Fiona said, her eyes flickering with quiet knowledge. And I heard what happened, how you were removed from the guest list. She paused, her gaze never leaving Maggie's. I'm sorry you were treated that way. The words hit Maggie like a punch to the stomach. She had thought about the wedding so many times over the past few hours, how she had walked in expecting to be part of something meaningful, only to be cast aside like an afterthought. The bitterness was still fresh, and Fiona's words stirred the wound. It's fine, Maggie murmured, though her voice was quieter than she wanted it to be. Fiona tilted her head, clearly not believing Maggie's calm demeanor. No, it's not, you deserve more than that. Maggie felt a flicker of something. Was it hope? The raw, empty ache that had consumed her for hours suddenly shifted, replaced by something unfamiliar. A spark, maybe, or just the promise of a chance at something. I don't plan on making a scene, Maggie said, almost to herself, but I won't beg for a place at the table. Fiona's eyes softened, but there was something steely in her gaze. You won't have to. I want to help you attend your son's wedding, not as an outsider but as someone who belongs there, and I think I know how. Maggie's brow furrowed. How? Fiona took a step closer, her voice low and measured. I have the means to make sure you get into that wedding with your dignity intact, but it won't come by asking for permission from your son or his wife. Maggie's heart pounded faster. What are you saying? Fiona gave her a knowing look, a slight glimmer of something more than sympathy in her eyes. I know what happened to you, Maggie. I know why they pushed you out, and I'm offering you a way to attend the wedding not as a guest who's been invited, but as a force they won't be able to ignore. Maggie swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. She didn't want to disrupt the wedding to stir up drama, but the thought of attending, of reclaiming what she'd been denied, felt right. Was she really considering this? Fiona's expression didn't change. You deserve more than to be erased from this event, and I think you deserve to do this on your terms, with respect, so will you take my offer? Maggie's heart beat louder in her chest, the words swirling around her. She had never been one to seek revenge, but this was different. This was about reclaiming the respect that had been taken from her, about standing up not just for herself, but for the sacrifices she had made for Andrew, for the years of unconditional love she had given. Finally she nodded, her voice steady. Yes, I'll do it. Fiona smiled, a quick, sharp curve of her lips. Good, it's time to remind them that no one can erase you from this story. As the words settled in the room, Maggie felt the gravity of her decision. The path she was about to walk wasn't one of confrontation, it was a path of quiet, undeniable power. She would attend the wedding, on her terms. But she couldn't help but wonder, as she followed Fiona out the door, what would it cost? Maggie sat at the small wooden desk, the dim light from the lamp casting long shadows over the papers Fiona had laid out before her. Fiona had been quiet for a moment, allowing Maggie to absorb the weight of the information. Maggie's heart was heavy as she flipped through the pages. You've been kept out for a reason, Fiona said, her voice low and direct. Tessa's been orchestrating everything, manipulating the narrative, controlling the situation. Maggie blinked, trying to process the words. She looked at the documents spread in front of her, the cold evidence of Tessa's machinations. Fiona picked up a sheet of paper and handed it to Maggie. Here's a message between Tessa and Andrew. It says, your mom will ruin the aesthetic. Maggie's breath hitched. The words were a slap, each one striking harder than the last. Aesthetic, it wasn't about family, it wasn't about love, it was about creating the perfect image, and Maggie had been excluded because she didn't fit it. She swallowed hard, trying to hold back the surge of hurt. Fiona didn't wait for her to speak, pulling out her phone. And here's something from the church rehearsal. She showed Maggie a series of texts between Tessa and Pastor Joel. The words were blunt. Make sure Maggie isn't at the rehearsal. She doesn't fit the image we're going for. Maggie's pulse quickened. She hadn't been invited to the rehearsal either. Her stomach twisted as she read the words. She had been erased not just from the guest list but from the entire event. This wedding is about control, Maggie, not love, Fiona continued. Tessa has carefully crafted everything around her, her version of the family, her perfect day, and you're not part of it. Maggie's mind spun. It wasn't about her son's happiness. It wasn't about a celebration. It was about presenting a curated version of their lives, one where she didn't belong. Andrew had agreed to all of this. Maggie's hand shook as she reached for the next page, but Fiona stopped her, her voice sharp now. You don't need to confront them, not directly. What you need to do is arrive at that wedding not as an outsider but with someone they can't ignore. Maggie looked up confused. What do you mean? Fiona's expression softened, but there was a steely glint in her eyes. You're going to bring someone they fear. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. Who? Fiona smiled faintly, pulling out a piece of paper. She slid it across the desk. Maggie's eyes flickered over it. A name, Linda Reed. Tessa's mother, the one Tessa had always claimed was dead. Maggie's breath caught. She'd heard rumors over the years, whispers in town about Tessa's estranged mother, but Maggie had never believed the stories. Tessa had lied. She's alive, Fiona said softly, and she has every right to be at that wedding. You'll bring her with you. Maggie sat back, stunned. Linda Reed, the key to shattering the carefully constructed lie Tessa had built. Fiona leaned forward. When Linda walks into that room, Tessa's carefully crafted image will collapse. It's time for the truth to come out. Maggie's chest tightened. This wasn't just about attending the wedding. It was about exposing the lies, about reclaiming what had been taken from her. She nodded slowly, her voice steady. Yes, let's do it. Fiona stood, gathering the papers. You won't regret this. As Fiona left, Maggie remained in the dim light, the weight of the decision settling in. She was about to walk into that wedding, but not alone, and Tessa's perfect image would never be the same. But Maggie couldn't shake the thought that lingered. What would Tessa do when the truth came crashing down? Maggie sat still, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the paper that contained Linda Reed's name. The weight of it felt heavier than any of the documents Fiona had given her. Linda Reed, Tessa's mother, the woman Tessa had insisted was dead, erased from her life and everyone else's. And yet she was very much alive. Fiona's words echoed in Maggie's mind. Tessa had created this lie, this perfect image of herself, one where Linda never existed. Maggie's stomach twisted as she considered everything that had happened. Why had Tessa felt the need to bury her own mother? Maggie's gaze lingered on the paper as if the name itself could reveal the answers she desperately needed. Finally, she asked, her voice almost a whisper, why would she do it, Fiona? Why lie about her mother? Fiona met her gaze, her expression unwavering. Because Linda was the one who exposed Tessa's lies years ago. Tessa was building a false image of herself, perfect, well-adjusted, and Linda saw through it. She knew the truth. Tessa couldn't have that. Maggie's chest tightened as the realization hit her like a cold wave. Tessa hadn't just hidden her mother from everyone, she had eliminated the one person who could reveal her true self. Linda Reed had been a threat to the image Tessa had built for herself, and so she was erased. Fiona continued, pulling out her phone and showing Maggie an old photo of Linda, a woman in her mid-60s, weathered but strong. Linda has been living in Charleston for years. I've kept in contact with her. She knows what's been happening. She knows exactly what Tessa did. Maggie's heart raced. Linda wasn't just some estranged relative. She was the key to destroying the false narrative Tessa had been spinning for years. Do you know where she is? Maggie asked, her voice hoarse with the urgency of the moment. Fiona nodded. I do. She's been living on the outskirts of town alone. I'll arrange for you to meet her. Maggie's mind spun with the possibilities. Tessa had created an elaborate lie, and now she had to face the truth. Linda Reed had been cut out of Tessa's life for a reason, but now she would be the one to help Maggie expose the reality Tessa had been so desperate to conceal. Tessa had spent years crafting a perfect image of herself, manipulating everyone, including Andrew, and now the very thing she feared most was coming for her, her mother, the one person who knew everything about her. Fiona's eyes softened as she saw Maggie's thoughts unfolding. Tessa fears Linda more than anyone, and she's right too. Linda won't hold back. She's been silent for far too long. Maggie felt a surge of determination mingled with a quiet sorrow. She had been pushed aside for so long, but now it was her turn to tack. Control. The thought of meeting Linda, the woman Tessa had banished, made her feel both empowered and conflicted. Tessa had done this to her. She had tried to erase her and rewrite their family's story, but Maggie wasn't going to let it continue. Not anymore. Fiona continued, "You don't have to confront Tessa directly, Maggie. This isn't about fighting, it's about revealing the truth. You'll go to the wedding with Linda, together." Maggie absorbed this quietly, feeling the gravity of the decision. She wasn't just going to show up at the wedding as a guest. She was going to walk in with the woman Tessa had feared for years, the woman who could bring everything crashing down. The idea felt almost unreal. Linda Reed, the name Tessa had hoped Maggie would never speak, and now it was the key to everything. Maggie swallowed hard, her voice steady. "I'm ready to meet her." Fiona smiled, a rare glimmer of approval in her eyes. "I'll arrange it soon." As Fiona gathered her things to leave, Maggie sat alone for a moment longer, the weight of the decision settling over her. The path she was about to walk would change everything. She would no longer be the invisible mother, cast aside and forgotten. Tessa's world was about to come undone. But as Maggie sat in silence, one question lingered, pulling at her. Would Andrew stand by her when everything came to light? The thought gnawed at her, but Maggie pushed it aside. It didn't matter, the truth would come out with or without his support. Maggie sat in the small cafe, her fingers tightly gripping the coffee mug as she tried to steady the trembling in her hands. The place was quiet, unassuming, a perfect spot to meet the woman who had been hidden from her family for years, the woman Tessa had erased from her life. Linda Reed. Maggie had heard rumors, whispers, but never the truth. Today she was about to meet Linda, the woman who could finally unravel Tessa's carefully spun lies. The thought of what Linda might reveal sent a cold shiver through Maggie, yet she couldn't help but feel the pull of hope. The truth was finally within reach. The door opened with a soft chime and Maggie's breath caught. She looked up, and there, framed by the doorway, stood Linda, the woman who had been pushed aside, silenced. She moved with a quiet strength, her eyes holding a depth of sorrow and resilience. She was older than Maggie had imagined, but there was a sharpness in her eyes, a sense of determination in her posture that couldn't be overlooked. Linda locked eyes with Maggie and made her way to the table. She paused before sitting down, studying Maggie for a moment, as if assessing the woman who had been caught in Tessa's web. "You're Maggie," Linda said, her voice steady with a hint of sadness. Maggie nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "Yes, and you're Linda." A fleeting smile tugged at Linda's lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show up," she said softly. Maggie's heart beat a little faster. "I had to. Tessa made everyone believe you were dead. I needed to understand why." Linda looked down briefly, her expression darkening as she took a slow breath. "I didn't choose to disappear, I was forced to. Tessa made it clear if I didn't stay out of her life, she'd destroy me, told everyone I abandoned her, that I wasn't fit to be her mother, and I let her spin her story. I had no choice." Maggie leaned in slightly, her chest tightening. Tessa had done the same to her, cast aside, blamed for things she hadn't done. It was a painful echo. "Why didn't you speak up?" Linda's eyes hardened, her lips tight with bitterness. I tried to tell the truth, but by then, Tessa controlled everything. She painted me as the villain and no one questioned it. Everyone believed her." Maggie's throat tightened. Tessa had done that to her too, manipulated everyone, twisted the truth, and turned them against her. Linda's voice softened, a slight tremor in her words. "She made everyone think I abandoned her because it was easier for her, but I didn't abandon her, I just couldn't keep enabling her lies. She needed to be stopped." Maggie's heart ached with empathy. Pain recognizes pain. They were both victims of the same woman. Linda pulled out a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "This is the proof. Letters, documents, everything that shows Tessa's version of our history is a lie. I kept them because, in some small way, I hoped one day someone would see the truth." Maggie opened the folder slowly, her hands shaking as she looked over the papers. The court documents, the letters, each one a damning piece of evidence against Tessa's fabricated story. The truth was all there in black and white. Linda's voice broke through Maggie's thoughts. "I've lived in silence for so long, Maggie, I can't be quiet anymore." Maggie's resolve strengthened. She wasn't alone in this. They were in this together. She leaned forward, her voice low but filled with conviction. You don't have to be silent anymore. We don't have to be silent. Linda's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Do you want me to come to the wedding? Her voice cracked with the weight of the question. Maggie's chest tightened, but she knew this was the moment to reclaim what had been stolen. The truth was ready to be exposed. Yes, Maggie said, her voice steady. I need you there. We'll go together. Linda nodded, her hand trembling as she reached across the table, brushing Maggie's fingers. Then let's do it. Maggie's heart surged with a strange peace as she stood. The storm was coming. Tessa wouldn't be ready for what was coming next. But a part of Maggie couldn't shake the thought that gnawed at her. Would Andrew stand by her when everything came to light? Maggie stood before her closet, her fingers brushing over the fabrics as if searching for a piece of herself lost in the years of silence and betrayal. The room around her was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each passing second reminding her that the moment had arrived. She reached for the dress, the navy gown that had once been meant for joy, for celebration. But today it felt like armor. The dress slid easily from its hanger, the smooth fabric catching the light as it fell into her hands. She held it for a moment, staring at the deep blue hue, remembering the last time she had worn it. Andrew's engagement party, when everything still felt whole, when she believed that their family was still intact. The weight of the fabric in her hands felt heavier than she remembered, as if it carried the memories of a lifetime, both lost and found. She hung the dress over the back of a chair and moved to the vanity. There, tucked away in a velvet-lined box, was her late husband's watch. Maggie took a slow breath before reaching for it, the familiar weight of it grounding her. She hadn't worn it in years, not since his death, but today it felt right. She clasped it around her wrist, the cold metal settling against her skin. You'll walk with me, she whispered softly, though the room was empty. It was a small comfort, but one she needed. Her husband had always believed in her, had always stood by her. Today she would need that strength, even if it was just in spirit. The doorbell rang, breaking the stillness. Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the sound, steadying herself. It was time. She opened the door to find Pastor Joel standing there, his presence calm and unwavering. Without a word, he stepped inside, his eyes taking in the scene, the dress, the watch, the quiet preparation. He didn't need to ask if she was ready. He could see it in her eyes. Maggie, he said, his voice gentle but firm, you're ready. Maggie nodded, her throat tight. She didn't feel ready, but she had to be. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen from her, about walking back into a world that had tried to silence her. Today, she would remind everyone that she was still part of this story. Pastor Joel arranged the seating, doing so with the quiet reverence of someone who knew the stakes. He didn't need to say much, his actions spoke for him. The church would be prepared for her arrival. No one would question her presence, no one would stop her, not today. In the next room, Fiona stood by the window, watching. When Maggie entered, she handed her a formal statement, crisp and prepared for any obstacle that might arise. In case they try to block you, Maggie, the truth will be with you. Maggie took the paper, her fingers steady now. The weight of the document in her hands felt like a small victory. Nothing could stop her now. Linda entered the room, her presence as steady as ever. She had chosen a simple dress, a soft beige with delicate lace. She didn't need anything extravagant. I'm not here for revenge, Linda said, her voice calm and resolute, just truth. Maggie looked at Linda, the two women standing side by side, ready to face the truth together. The words hung in the air between them, simple but powerful. This wasn't about retribution. It was about the truth finally being spoken. Maggie's heart raced as she looked at Linda, then down at the dress, her own pulse quickening. She felt both nerves and strength in equal measure, an overwhelming sense that the moment she had waited for had finally arrived. Tessa wouldn't be ready for what was coming. But as Maggie stood, preparing to leave the room, a quiet fear gnawed at her, the question she hadn't allowed herself to voice until now. Would Andrew be able to see her? Would he be able to hear the truth when it finally came? The thought lingered, but she pushed it aside. Today was about more than Andrew, it was about reclaiming her place. And as she stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next, one thought echoed in her mind. The truth was coming and nothing could stop it. The wedding venue was grand, but as Maggie entered, it felt distant, cold-like. An empty stage waiting for its performance. The grandeur of the place, the white and gold decor, all seemed to fade into the background as she walked forward. Linda walked just behind her, the two of them moving with quiet strength. They were ready. Guests turned their heads as Maggie entered. Whispers began, growing louder with every step. "She's here. Didn't they say she couldn't make it?" Maggie felt their eyes on her, but she didn't waver. This was her place. She belonged here no matter what Tessa had tried to do to erase her. At the entrance, security stepped forward. A tall, young guard blocked their path, his face unreadable. Maggie's pulse quickened, but she steadied herself. Behind her, Fiona and Pastor Joel stood silently, their presence reinforcing the authority of the moment. Pastor Joel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We are expected." The guard hesitated, eyes flicking down to the guest list, then back up at the group. He clearly had orders, but it didn't take much for him to step aside, allowing them through. A few murmurs spread like wildfire across the room as Maggie passed. Tessa was at the altar, standing with Andrew. She looked like a vision of perfection in her dress, but when her eyes landed on Maggie, her face paled. A moment of shock, of disbelief, before she quickly masked it with a tight smile. Maggie locked eyes with her, but she didn't flinch. Tessa's perfect world was crumbling, one layer at a time. Maggie had no intention of playing into her image anymore. Today, the truth was what mattered. Behind Maggie, Linda entered the room. Her calm presence was the opposite of the chaos that had been stirred up. When Tessa's eyes fell on Linda, it was as if the air had been sucked from the room. There was no question now. Linda had been erased, and yet here she was, standing tall. Andrew's face registered confusion, then something deeper. He stood frozen, his eyes flickering between Maggie and Linda, unable to speak. Tessa, her smile now tight and forced, tried to maintain composure, but Linda's quiet voice cut through the tension. "Smile for your guests, sweetheart." The words were simple but loaded, each syllable making Tessa's facade crack just a little more. The perfection of the moment Tessa had tried so hard to create, broken by the very people she'd tried to silence. Maggie's heart ached for Andrew, but she kept her focus. This wasn't just about him, it was about truth, about finally being seen. As Tessa stood, trying to regain her composure, Maggie stood tall, resolute. This was her moment, the moment when everything she had been denied would be reclaimed. And yet, as she faced the truth she had longed for, one painful thought lingered in her mind. Would Andrew ever see her as his mother again? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the ceremony moved forward, but Maggie was no longer afraid. The storm was here, and the truth was finally in the light. The tension in the room was palpable as Maggie stood by the aisle, her heart racing. She could feel the eyes of the guests on her, whispers crackling through the air like static. The truth had arrived, and the perfect image Tessa had spent years constructing was beginning to fracture. But it was only the beginning. Tessa's smile, once so tight, faltered further as she looked at Linda. It was a smile stretched thin, barely holding together under the weight of the truth that had walked into the room. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the altar. The wedding, which had been so carefully designed to look flawless, was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Maggie could see Tessa's eyes flicker toward security, a silent plea for them to step in. Her voice, though strained, was barely above a whisper when she addressed the guard. "Get them out of here," Tessa hissed, her face flushed, her gaze flickering between Linda and Maggie. The guard took a step forward, his hand moving toward his earpiece. But before he could speak, Pastor Joel was already there, his presence unwavering. "They have every right to be here," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the tension. "They're not going anywhere." The guard hesitated, his expression shifting from authority to confusion. Tessa's face paled as she realized there was nothing more she could do. Her perfect world, so meticulously crafted, was collapsing piece by piece. Guests murmured, the whispers growing louder as Linda stood there, calm and resolute, an undeniable presence in the room. Maggie didn't flinch, standing tall in the face of it all. This wasn't about revenge. This was about truth. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. The room buzzed with confusion, curiosity, and something else, fear. Tessa's carefully controlled image, the one that had been so carefully built over the years, was now starting to crack. They were all witnessing the fall of her perfect facade. Andrew, still standing beside Tessa, stared at the scene unfolding before him. His face was a mixture of disbelief and something darker, something Maggie couldn't quite place. His gaze flicked between Maggie and Linda, and he finally opened his mouth, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Andrew asked, his voice thick with a mixture of hurt and confusion. Maggie's heart twisted at the question, but she remained steady. Her voice was calm, almost soothing. "I didn't hide your wife's mother, Andrew," she said, her words carrying the weight of years of sacrifice. This was her truth. Andrew opened his mouth to say something else but stopped himself, unable to process the weight of the words. He looked at Tessa as if waiting for her to explain, but Tessa didn't have the words anymore. She stood there, rooted to the spot as the truth continued to seep through the cracks. In her carefully constructed image, Linda took a deep breath and with a soft but clear voice spoke to the room. "I want to thank Maggie," she said, her voice strong despite the tears that threatened to spill over, "for bringing me here today, for letting the truth finally be seen." The room fell silent at her words. Guests exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to respond. The reality of the situation had shifted, and the power dynamics that had existed moments ago had changed. Tessa's grip on her perfect reputation was slipping, and there was no going back. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Linda stand tall, taking control of the narrative. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen from both of them. As the murmurs continued to swirl around them, Maggie met Andrew's eyes. She didn't know if he understood yet, but in that moment she knew that the truth had been spoken. There was no going back from this. And Tessa, standing beside Andrew, could only watch as her perfect world crumbled, piece by piece. The stillness in the room was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Maggie stood near the back, her eyes fixed on Tessa and Andrew as they stood before the altar. The grandeur of the venue had faded into the background, replaced by a quiet intensity that made everything seem distant, unimportant compared to the weight of the truth that hung in the air. The ceremony, which had been meant to celebrate love, now felt like a ritual of contradiction. How could they possibly move forward? The cracks in Tessa's perfect world were now visible to everyone, and yet the vows would still be said. The ritual would continue, but could the foundation of these promises ever hold? Tessa's voice trembled as the officiant asked them to exchange their vows. For a moment, she hesitated, as if the words were caught somewhere deep inside her. The image she had so carefully curated was already shattered, and now, with the eyes of the room on her, she was struggling to hold herself together. I promise to love and cherish you," Tessa's voice cracked, her words barely escaping her lips. The hesitation, the break in her voice was unmistakable. The truth had already begun to erode her ability to speak them. Maggie watched quietly, her heart heavy. Tessa was unraveling, her carefully crafted life no longer fitting together the way it once had. Maggie stood still, her expression composed, but every muscle in her body was taut with the knowledge that the woman in front of her was no longer the same. The illusion was gone, and no amount of vows could bring it back. Andrew stood beside Tessa, his posture stiff, his eyes flicking toward Maggie almost involuntarily. Every time he looked her way, Maggie saw the flicker of something she couldn't quite read: shame, regret. He looked lost, adrift in the situation, unable to make sense of what was happening. He hadn't been able to speak a word since the truth was revealed. Now he kept his eyes down, his fingers twitching against his side, a restless gesture that spoke volumes. Had he truly believed Tessa's lies for so long? The disappointment that Maggie felt in him was painful but quiet. This wasn't just about Tessa. This was about a son who had turned his back on the one person who had always been there for him. As the vows continued, Andrew's eyes flicked to Maggie again, and this time she held his gaze. The brief glance was loaded with everything that hadn't been said. Maggie's heart ached, but she didn't let it show. She wasn't here to make him see her. She was here to ensure that the truth stood tall. Tessa's voice cracked again as she said her final words of commitment. The silence that followed hung thick in the air. The guests were uncomfortably shifting in their seats, some glancing at one another, others at the ground, unsure of what to do. Linda stood silently at the back of the room, her eyes filled with quiet heartbreak as she watched her daughter struggle. Maggie felt her own chest tighten. The woman who had been cast aside for years was watching her daughter's life crumble in front of her. The love Linda had for Tessa was clear, but it was a love laced with sorrow, a love that had been long denied. Maggie's gaze flickered back to Tessa, who was now holding Andrew's hand, her palms sweaty, her fingers trembling. The ceremony had ground to a halt, no one knowing whether to proceed, how to proceed. This was no longer just a wedding. This was a moment where everything Tessa had built was crashing down around her, and there was no way to hide it anymore. Maggie stayed composed, her breathing steady, her eyes unwavering. She would not raise her voice. Today, the truth was loud enough. The room was silent as the wedding ceremony stalled, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. Tessa, still holding Andrew's hand, was trying desperately to maintain some semblance of control, but it was slipping through our fingers. Maggie, however, stood at the edge of the chaos, steady and calm. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. When Andrew's gaze shifted toward her again, Maggie could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He had barely spoken since the truth had been revealed, and his discomfort was palpable. The harsh reality of everything that had unfolded weighed heavily on his shoulders, but Maggie had no intention of sparing him. She took a breath and finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "Andrew, there's something you need to understand." Andrew blinked, confused, his eyes wide. "What do you mean?" Maggie's heart tightened as she looked at her son, still so lost in the web that Tessa had woven. "It's about Linda," she continued, her gaze never leaving his. "Your wife's mother. She's not dead, Andrew, she's alive. Tessa's been hiding the truth from you." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Andrew's face shifted from confusion to something else, betrayal. His eyes darted toward Tessa, who stood frozen, pale and trembling beside him. The weight of the revelation was sinking in. "You knew about this?" Andrew asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You knew about Linda?" Maggie nodded slowly. "I knew. I wasn't going to make a scene, but I knew the truth. Your wife's mother was cast out of her life years ago, and Tessa made sure no one ever questioned it. She made everyone believe her story, Andrew, and you chose to believe it." Andrew's face crumpled as the realization set in, his eyes flicking back to his mother. "All this time, I never knew. She told me you were the problem, that you were the one who caused all this." Maggie's heart hurt, but she didn't flinch. The damage had already been done. "It wasn't me, Andrew, it was never me. Tessa used her power over you, manipulated your perception of me, and for years you let her. She made you believe lies, and now, look where we are." Andrew's eyes glistened and he turned away from her, his back tense with the weight of the emotions he was fighting to control. Maggie could see the strain in his shoulders, the frustration building up inside him. He reached for his forehead, his hand shaking. I chose her over my own mother." The words struck Maggie like a physical blow, and for a moment she stood frozen, watching her son crumble under the weight of his own guilt. He had believed Tessa's lies over the love she had given him his whole life. "Andrew," Maggie said softly, taking a step toward him, "I never intended to embarrass you or Tessa. I just wanted to be treated with respect, to be seen for who I really am, not the villain she painted me to be." Andrew's breath hitched and he finally turned to face her, tears spilling from his eyes. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I didn't realize how deep the lies went. I didn't know. I thought I was doing what was right." Maggie's heart broke for him. She could see the turmoil on his face, the guilt that was eating him alive, but she couldn't protect him from his choices, not this time. "I forgive you, Andrew," Maggie whispered, her voice gentle, though there was a quiet steel beneath it. "But I can't forgive your choices, not yet." Andrew's shoulders sagged and he dropped his head into his hands, finally breaking down. The reality of what had just been revealed about his wife, his mother, and his entire life was too much for him to bear in that moment. Maggie stood there, watching him, her own chest tight with the grief of the years lost, the love denied. The room around them seemed to close in, the ceremony forgotten as the truth took center stage. There was no going back from this. The lies had been exposed, but the damage they had done would linger. The questions still hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Would Andrew ever be able to truly see her again as the mother who had always been there for him? As Andrew's sobs echoed in the silence of the room, Maggie couldn't help but wonder if that answer would ever come. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with a mixture of disbelief and raw emotion. Maggie stood, her heart heavy with everything that had happened. She had never wanted this moment, never wanted to drag Tessa's lies into the light like this. But the truth, once unleashed, had a momentum all its own, and now Tessa had no choice but to face it. Tessa, still at the altar with Andrew, was the first to break the silence. She turned toward Maggie, her voice thin, shaky. "I'm sorry," she said, but there was no conviction in her words. "I never wanted it to come to this." Maggie looked at her, still composed, though every inch of her wanted to collapse under the weight of what had been revealed. Tessa's apology was more about herself than it was about anyone else. "You didn't want this?" Maggie's voice was calm, steady, but there was a quiet anger there too. "Then why did you do it, Tessa? Why did you let these lies fester for so long?" Tessa's eyes narrowed, her defensiveness quickly rising. "I didn't ask for you to come here today," she said, her voice now rising with indignation. "You've made a scene, you've ruined everything." Maggie's breath caught in her chest at the words. She could see the shift, the way Tessa was trying to make it all about her again. "I didn't come here to make a scene," Maggie replied evenly, her gaze never wavering from Tessa's. "I came here to bring the truth, something you've worked so hard to bury." The guests, once unsure of what to say, were now watching the scene unfold with bated breath. Their whispers had faded into an uncomfortable silence, everyone sensing that something far deeper than a wedding was unraveling in front of them. Linda, who had stood silently until now, finally stepped forward. Her voice, soft but firm, carried through the room. "Tessa," she began, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity, "I'm done being your secret." The room seemed to still as Linda's words echoed through the air. Tessa's perfect world had been predicated on secrets, on silencing those who might expose the truth. And now Linda, the one person Tessa had erased from her life, was taking back her voice. Tessa flinched at the words, the color draining from her face. Maggie could see it, the realization, the slow and painful understanding that the walls she'd so carefully built were crumbling around her. "I never wanted to hurt you, Tessa," Linda continued, her voice steady, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But you've kept me in the shadows for too long, and I'm not going to let you do that anymore." Tessa's breath hitched as she tried to compose herself. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words didn't come. The mask she had worn for so long, the one that had kept her image so perfectly intact, was slipping piece by piece. For the first time, Tessa was confronted by the magnitude of the lies she had lived with. Andrew stood beside her, silent, his face a mask of confusion and regret. Maggie's gaze softened toward him for a moment, but she didn't speak. This was between Tessa and Linda now. Fiona, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, finally stepped forward. Her voice was clear, firm, and full of authority. "Humiliation isn't revenge," she said, addressing the room. "What you're witnessing isn't an act of vengeance. It's honesty, it's the truth finally coming to light." Maggie's heart swelled at Fiona's words. The truth, no matter how painful, was always the only path forward. This wasn't just about a wedding or a family torn apart, it was about reclaiming what had been stolen. She couldn't have done this without Linda, without the courage to stand against Tessa's carefully curated world. The room was still, the weight of Fiona's statement hanging in the air. Tessa's face was pale, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if seeking some way out, some escape from the reality that had unfolded. But there was no escape. The truth had already been spoken. Maggie, standing tall and unwavering, took a final breath. The storm was far from over. But for the first time, Tessa's mask had cracked, and Maggie had no intention of letting her rebuild it. The room was still, the weight of the truth hanging thick in the air. Tessa's face was pale, her mask slipping further as the guests exchanged uneasy glances. The perfect world she had worked so hard to construct had shattered, and Maggie felt no satisfaction in that, only a quiet, steady resolve. But just as the silence threatened to swallow them all, Pastor Joel, who had been standing in the back of the room, stepped forward. His expression was calm, though there was something in his eyes, something knowing, that made Maggie's breath catch. "Maggie," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I think it's time for you to hear something." Maggie's heart skipped. What was this? The world around her was already in the midst of unraveling. What could possibly follow that would change the tide? Joel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded letter, old and worn, its edges slightly curled with age. It was familiar to Maggie, and a deep ache blossomed in her chest as she realized what it was. "This is from your husband," Joel continued, holding the letter up for Maggie to see. "He left it for you." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't thought about what her husband might have left behind or that this moment would arrive. But here it was, a letter that had never been opened, a message waiting to be heard. Tessa stood frozen, her face twisted in confusion, though Maggie's eyes never left the letter. This wasn't just about today, this was about everything that had come before. With a trembling hand, Maggie took the letter from Joel, unfolding the delicate paper. She knew her husband's handwriting intimately, each word, each curve of the pen a reminder of the love they had shared. As she read, her heart both broke and healed. D in equal measure. The words were simple, written in the way her husband had always spoken to her. "If ever they forget who you are, Maggie, remind them. For moments when they forget, I leave this for you, a blessing for your heart, a foundation for your feet." Maggie's chest tightened, a surge of emotion rising. He had known there would come a time when she would need reminding, not just of who she was, but of who she had been to them all. The matriarch, the one who had stood strong even when everything seemed to collapse. Her eyes flickered to Andrew, standing still beside Tessa, his face drawn in confusion and shame. But now there was something else, something more in his eyes: realization. Tessa's voice finally broke the silence, her tone shaking, desperate. "What is this, Joel?" She took a step toward him, her hand trembling. "Why are you giving her that letter now?" Joel met her gaze, unflinching. "Because Maggie's place in this family was never in question. She wasn't an outsider, Tessa, she was the foundation, and her husband knew that, even when you chose to tear it all down." Maggie's heart swelled, but there was no bitterness in her. She had been quiet for too long, allowing others to define her place in this family. Now the truth was being spoken aloud for everyone to hear. Andrew stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached for the letter. His eyes were wet, his voice raw. "Mom, I never knew," he whispered, his words thick with regret. "I didn't understand." Maggie didn't move as Andrew read the letter. His face crumpled further, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, the weight of the truth finally settling on his shoulders. The father he had lost, the family he had betrayed, the mother he had neglected, he saw it all now. He turned to face Maggie, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm so sorry." Tessa stood there, speechless, her hands trembling at her sides as the room's attention shifted away from her. No longer could she hold onto the image she had so carefully curated. The respect that had once been hers was now sliding back to Maggie where it had always belonged. Maggie didn't answer Andrew's apology right away. She simply stood, taking in the moment, the flood of emotions, the weight of the truth. But as the silence stretched, a quiet understanding passed between mother and son. This moment had changed everything. The truth had finally been spoken, and there was no going back. The music swelled softly, filling the room with the gentle strains of a song that had once been a part of a happier memory. Maggie stood at the edge of the dance floor, her breath steadying as the room fell into a sudden hush. The truth had been laid bare, and now finally there was space for something else. The sound of the guests shifting in their seats was replaced by the sound of her footsteps, slow but resolute. She took one step forward, then another. The floor beneath her felt firm, steady. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath as Maggie moved toward the center of the dance floor. She wasn't sure why she felt compelled to do this, why she felt this pull toward the space that had once been reserved for the bride and groom. As Maggie's heels clicked against the floor, a hush fell over the guests. No one expected this. Her heart raced, the weight of everything she had lived through, all of it bubbling beneath the surface. But this wasn't about revenge, it wasn't even about closure. This was about taking back what had always been hers, claiming the space she had once been denied. And then, to her surprise, there was applause. It started low, hesitant, but it quickly gained strength. The guests rose to their feet, some wiping their eyes, others unsure of what to say or do, but united in their acknowledgement of what Maggie had done. This was a moment of reckoning, and they all felt it. Maggie's eyes flickered toward Tessa, who stood frozen at the altar. Her face was a mixture of disbelief and something softer, something like humility. For the first time since Maggie had entered the room, Tessa was humbled. She stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, eyes wide as Maggie moved gracefully toward the center. She had built her life on control and perfection, but now she was forced to watch it unravel. Beside Maggie, Linda stood quietly. There was no grandeur to her presence, just the quiet, steady acknowledgement that she had been hidden for far too long. Linda's gaze softened as she watched Maggie, a flicker of pride and recognition in her eyes. She had never asked for this moment, but here they were. Finally, Linda was seen. Maggie reached the center of the floor, her pulse quickening, but she didn't stop. This was her moment. She could feel Andrew's gaze on her, burning with a mixture of guilt, love, and something else, something hard to place. He stood on the edge of the room, watching, his face pale and drawn. Would he ever understand? Then, just as the room seemed to be still, Andrew stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper, carrying over the quiet applause. "I won't forget again," he said, his eyes locked onto hers, his expression raw with emotion. Maggie's heart tightened at the words, and for the briefest of moments, she faltered. She had wanted this acknowledgement, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to do with it. Still, she stayed composed, standing tall at the center of the room, her gaze steady. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic ending. The truth had been spoken, and for the first time in a long while, Maggie could finally breathe. Her heart softened slowly, carefully, as she looked at her son, at Linda beside her, at the guests who were standing to honor her. She didn't know what came next, but she knew this: the truth would carry her through whatever came. And with that, she began to dance, alone but not lonely. The evening wound down, but Maggie had not yet left the wedding venue. She stood by the door, feeling the weight of the day pressing against her, yet there was a strange peace settling in her chest. The applause had faded, the conversations softened to murmurs, but the truth lingered in the air like a lingering perfume. She glanced at the envelope in her hands. Inside, there was a handwritten letter from Andrew. His apology, raw and unrefined, was written in shaky handwriting. His words were filled with regret and sorrow, each one heavier than the last. Maggie unfolded the letter slowly, each word stirring something deep inside her. "Mom, I didn't understand until now. I failed you. I've seen the truth, how much I've let Tessa's lies blind me. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try. I can't change the past, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I should have been there for you, always. I will be from now on." Maggie felt a tightness in her chest as she read the words, the old ache of lost years resurfacing, but she couldn't help the faint stir of hope that followed. Hope for reconciliation, even if it would take time. Her eyes moved to the second letter, the one from Tessa. It was thin, almost delicate, and as Maggie opened it, she braced herself for what might come. "Maggie, I don't know where to start. I was wrong in so many ways. I've spent years hiding behind lies, protecting my image, and I've hurt so many in the process. Especially you. I'm sorry for everything I did. If there's any way we can rebuild, if you're willing, I'd like to start again, for the sake of the family, for the sake of truth." Maggie's fingers trembled slightly as she placed the letter down. Tessa's words weren't easy to read, her pride still too strong, her apology too carefully crafted, but it was a start. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Linda, standing just outside, her presence as quiet and grounded as ever. Maggie's heart swelled. After everything that had been hidden, Linda was finally being seen. "You ready to go?" Linda asked, her voice warm but with an edge of quiet sadness. Maggie nodded, sliding the letters back into the envelope. She felt the weight of it all: Andrew's apology, Tessa's fragile attempt at reconciliation, the storm they had all weathered together. As they walked out of the venue, the soft hum of the night air greeted them, but Maggie felt something new stir inside her: peace, not perfection, but peace. The drive back was quiet, each passing mile feeling like a bridge between the past and the future. The house she returned to wasn't the same empty shell it had been earlier. It was hers again. For the first time in a long while, she felt her place was secure, not just in the walls of her home, but in the fabric of her family. She entered the house, the familiar scent of wood and old books filling the air. As she walked to the desk where she kept her journals, her phone buzzed. It was Fiona. "Maggie, how are you?" Fiona's voice was calm but steady, a lifeline. "I just wanted to check in. You know you have me, right? If they hurt you again, you know who to dial." Maggie's lips quirked into a faint smile and she whispered a soft, "Thank you," before hanging up. The weight of the day, the weight of the years settled in her chest, but this time it was lighter. She took a deep breath and sat down at her desk, opening her journal. Her pen glided across the page as she wrote, "Respect isn't given, it's remembered." The words came to her naturally, as if they had always been there, waiting for her to claim them. Maggie closed the journal with a soft click, setting it beside her. She stood, feeling her strength, her worth fully intact. "They removed my name from the list," she whispered to the empty room, "but they couldn't remove me from the story." The words lingered in the quiet of the night, but for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt the freedom to let them stand.